Okay, welcome to a masterclass on carbon taxes. So I have two experts, two good friends of mine, joining me to help us out a bit with this whole idea. So let's, in the interest of being fair, alphabetical, let's start with Aniket Shah. Aniket Shah is the managing director and the global head of ESG and sustainability research at Jefferies. Aniket leads integration of ESG and sustainability analysis within the Global Investment Research Department, engages with clients on this dynamic area of corporate and financial services. I think I can tell you Aniket was voted the institutional investor, best analyst, or he's basically a rock star. That's all you need to know about Aniket. He's a fabulous guy, affiliated with Columbia in many ways, always generous with his time, extremely scholarly, one of those rare scholar practitioners, who I actually look up to. Fabulous guy. Not to be left behind, we have the other celebrity in our midst, our actor, Gernot Wagner, who's a climate economist at CBS, Columbia Business School, author of many books, Climate Shock, and most recently, Geoengineering, The Gamble. Uh, you know, I think if you look at how prolific Gernot, I don't know how I keep up with him. I just cannot. He's like, you have like one New York Times op-ed a week, something in science. I mean, the guy is just amazing. Okay, so these two are the best possible people to come up with, help us out with this complicated topic of carbon taxes. So I'm guessing the audience in general knows what a carbon tax is, but if one of you wants to maybe just start with a brief introduction of what is a carbon tax, why do economists think this might be perhaps the best tool we might have to address the climate issue, just to get us started, and then we can go on and maybe probe a little deeper on some of these issues. Anyone, doesn't matter. Maybe the professor. Well, both of you are professors.
Yeah, professor. Professor, over to you, sir.
Well, let me start with this. Nobody is going to win a Nobel Prize for this insight because pricing carbon, pricing externalities has been with us for so long that the guy whose name is attached to it died a decade before the first Nobel Prize was given out, right? So we've known about the solution for a long, long time. Okay, what is that? Okay, the nerdiest way to say it is internalizing the externality, the carbon climate externality, or any externalities for that matter, right? It's the costs that 8 billion of us incur, and the person who is doing the polluting, is incurring a fraction of a penny, much like everybody else, but isn't paying for the full cost. When I board a flight across the Atlantic, that's 1 ton of CO2 emissions, literally a metric ton of CO2, not the whole plane, just the seat, back in economy class. That ton of CO2 causes pollution, causes damages. What's the answer? For me to pay for my own damages. I mean, that's it. That's the answer. And the carbon price, writ large, a carbon tax, is the idea of ensuring that happens. I emit, I pollute, I pay.
So as a follow-up, and chime in, Aniket, anytime you want to jump in. And I understand yours is more of a investor spin on the whole conversation, and we'll probably get to you and flesh that out a little more. But just to set the stage a little bit, if this is so simple, why haven't we seen an application of this idea? Or is there an application of this idea anywhere in the world? Has it actually worked? How might we design a good carbon tax?
So first of all, I think we need to expand this conversation beyond just carbon taxes and talk about prices more generally. And I think that's key. Actually, we had a carbon tax, a carbon price, in 1306 England. King Edward I banned the burning of sea coal. Guess what the penalty was for repeat offenders? Death.
Wow.
That was the first climate
Did not
policy. I mean,
know.
okay, obviously it was not a climate policy, right? I mean, we had that because, air was filthy and his mom had asthma, as we think we know now, right? So lots of other things happening. And by the way, it didn't last long, right? It took a few years, then the king himself died, his brother took over, and frankly, one industrial revolution later, right? And we are still burning coal, right? So, no, the death penalty, right, didn't do it. But okay, death penalty in economic terms, that's an infinite cost, if there ever was one, right? It's basically an infinite tax on burning coal. And yeah, that's an example of a policy that tells us to, cut it out, right? Don't burn coal. You'll die if you get caught. And frankly, any policy that makes it harder to pollute is a price on pollution, an explicit price or an implicit price, and economists typically like explicit ones better. And yes, the tax is an example. Okay, now why don't we have it more widely? Because tax is a four-letter word in Washington, right? That's why we don't. But actually, there are some positive examples. There's lots of them. European Union, to use maybe the most prominent one, has an emissions trading system that covers half of all CO2 emissions emitted by 400 plus million Europeans. And the price right now is about 100 euros per ton of CO2. $100 almost. Well, that's a significant step in the right direction. And yeah, basically we have, actually, quite literally, we have one law in economics, right? Economists run around claiming that, people behave like atoms in a vacuum and we pretend to be like physicists and so on often. Much of that is just not true. We have emotions and so on and so forth. But there's one law we have in economics. Price up, quantity demanded down. It works every single time, out of the two exceptions we've figured out by now. CO2 isn't one of them, right? You price CO2 and the quantity demanded goes down. Why are we not doing it universally, right? Why don't we just do it, declare climate change solved and move on? Well, because lots of vested interests, because there are lots of profits to be made by burning coal, oil, gas, and dumping your pollution into the atmosphere and letting other people deal with it.
Yeah, just to come in on that, around a quarter of the world's emissions today is under some type of carbon pricing regime. And Gernot is absolutely right that what the Europeans have done, it took a while, by the way. It didn't work initially. The prices were too low. There was a little mess up called the 2008 financial crisis. And so the prices plummeted. There were too many permits out there and so on and so forth. But now you're getting a very strong signal, a market signal, that it costs you 100 euros a ton to emit carbon, CO2. And that means that if you are a utility, and soon if you're in aviation or in transport, if you can do something for less than 100 euros per ton, which is what your opportunity costs. In other words, if you can do something less than 100 euros per ton to not emit that ton of CO2, you're in the money. That's then a good decision for you. And if you can't, then yeah, you just buy that credit for 100 euros. And it's interesting, a lot of climate solutions become very interesting if the bar is 100 euros. And that number has gone up 7x since the Paris Agreement. Probably the best way to have played the fact that the world was taking climate change seriously was the European ETS carbon dioxide spot price. That and maybe Tesla were the two ways to have played it, and you would have made a lot of money in both ways. So Gernot is absolutely right, and for folks who are listening, you all know that he is truly one of the great minds in this space, and his book, Climate Shock, I read when I was a student, and it really changed the way I look at the world. So it's a really so it's great for us to be talking to him. But yeah, so that's just a thought about that it is out there. China has an emissions trading system. It only is a small portion of the economy, but it is growing, and they're trying to figure it out. India just announced that they are setting up an emissions trading system. So the mechanisms are known. They're hard, but we know how to do it. It's just exactly as Gernot said, the internal politics, the vested interests, the all of that is hard to figure out, but can be figured out.
So let me follow up. And coming back to the US, is there any realistic hope or chance for a US carbon tax, say in the next 10 years?
Aniket, why don't you?
No, please, you start.
No.
You start.
No, actually, okay. So U.S. is a great. So there are some U.S. states that have an explicit carbon price. California, right? So if you're wondering where my accent comes from, same dual citizenship as the guy who signed the emissions trading system into law in California. He came across the Atlantic with a few more steroids in his suitcase than I did. And all right, so 85% of California's emissions, by the way, more than Europe's, 85% of all greenhouse gas emissions are covered under this emissions trading system that has a lower price per ton. It's not as ambitious, if you will, as the European one. It's like, $20 or so, 17, I think, the last I saw, per ton of CO2. But it covers more emissions. And California is doing lots and lots of other things. Low carbon fuel standard, for example, directly aimed at the transport sector, which has explicit prices, which now are a little bit lower than they used to be. But at some point, they were at $200 per ton of CO2 equivalent in the transport sector, right? Now, you don't associate California with the sort of, state that does a lot to rein in emissions from internal combustion engines, right? Everybody drives, right? But yes, it does, and it incentivizes a move in the right direction. And on top of that, right, frankly, if there's one thing we have in economics, it's this price up, demand down, right? If there's another thing, is relative prices is what matters, right? It's not about absolute prices, it's all about relative prices. So another way to look at carbon pricing is to say, how cheap is the alternative? And frankly, from a policy perspective, when you subsidize the alternative, right? When you subsidize clean, you price dirty. Implicitly, indirectly, relatively speaking, but you do. Okay, the Inflation Reduction Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the Chips and Science Act, right? Like, depending on who is counting. Actually, I'd love to hear Aniket's answer to that. It's sort of some estimates are up to $2 trillion worth of clean energy subsidies from those three laws. Every one of these dollars is, in fact, a price on pollution. And on top of that, actually, very few people sort of know that explicitly, but the Inflation Reduction Act does not have a price on carbon. It doesn't. It has a price on methane. It has a price on methane emissions of something like $900 per ton of methane. Much more potent greenhouse gas than CO2. Not a replacement for pricing carbon, but very, very important in and of itself.
Yeah, look, I think that there are a few things to add to what Gernot said about the U.S. when it comes to our pricing of carbon. First is just for sake of completion, even here in the Northeast, there is a carbon pricing regime through the RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. And again, the prices are low, it's only for a portion of the economy and so on. But in policymaking, part of this is just to know it is possible. And the reality is, even in a country as divided as we are, it is in fact possible, both on the East Coast and on the West Coast. That's point number one. Point number two is that I very much agree with what Gernot said about the importance of relative pricing. And I would argue that the Inflation Reduction Act does put a price per ton of CO2 because you get tax credits for doing certain things in terms of carbon sequestration and removal. So there's a $85 per ton tax credit if you can show that you have captured and sequestered a ton of CO2. So imagine if you're a utility and it costs you anything less than $85, you're in the money. And so that trade makes sense all day, all night. Now we can debate whether CCS is a part of the solution or not. People have wildly different views. We had Professor John Holdren, who is President Obama's chief science advisor, a very famous physicist at Harvard, on our platform at Jefferies the other day, saying that carbon capture is a part of the solution. And yesterday we did a call with Professor Mark Jacobson at Stanford, who showed in a brilliant engineering presentation that it absolutely doesn't make sense at all. So we can debate whether that is a good solution, but the price signal is there. Similarly, $180 per ton tax credit for direct air capture. If you can capture it for less than 180, then it's profitable because you're getting 180 from the government. If you're spending 179, you're doing that all day. So it is. So that's that. Now we haven't talked yet about the voluntary carbon markets, which I'm guessing, Shiva, we will get to over today's discussion. And there are lots of controversies around that, and people have very strong opinions about it. One of the interesting elements of it, though, to me, is that the fact that so many companies are willing to buy offsets, to me, shows that the idea of not just putting a price on carbon, but paying for it, is starting to really enter people's psyches. And that's a big push because we weren't used to paying for this, and now companies are saying, "Shit, we'll pay for it." And so there is an evolution happening on this pricing. It's not enough. The dollar values are too low. I think the World Bank says the weighted average price per ton of CO2 today is $3 or $4. Gernot would know much better than I what that number should be. It should probably be around between 100 and 200 at a minimum. But so we're off in terms of the dollar amount, but there are green shoots, I would say.
So you covered a whole host of issues. Let me just step back and summarize what I think I heard. Maybe there are two ways to do this. One is to tax your way out or incent your way out. I think I've heard both of you just talking about the second part. In the US, it's probably easier to just incent your way out or just give people subsidies and credits as opposed to taxing, which is fine. And second, maybe the action is more in the states at the local level as opposed to the federal level, given the difficult politics here. So let me, and we'll come to the voluntary part because that's fascinating as well. A quick detour back to Europe. So the ETS, if I remember reading this right, I remember reading that a lot of the lobbying fire just got redirected into getting concessions to get out of the ETS, for instance. And I don't know enough about the institutional environment there. Maybe Gurnot or maybe Aniket. How accurate is that characterization? I mean, is it as sweeping as some people claim it is? Because if the lobbying simply just morphs into a different way of kind of getting concessions out of this regime, how effective is that? I heard steel companies got exemptions, a lot of others did. And is that what is in store for us in the future, perhaps here? And then we can talk a little more about the other European initiatives as well. Sorry.
Okay, so look, right, lobbyists are going to lobby, right? So if you're a steel company and you are basically polluting for free or now, and there's this threat of you having to pay for your pollution, well, by the way, right, everybody else should look at this and say, wait, like, you're just dumping pollution for free into the atmosphere and let the rest of us deal with it, right? Like of course, right? Pay for your damn pollution, right? Okay. I guess the question how vested interest deals with this is an important one, and now we are sort of in the more detailed questions around instrument choice, for example, right? Which policy instrument is the right one? And actually, so here's a quick 101, sort of taxes versus emissions trading. Okay, if you tax every ton of CO2, try to, as a policymaker, yeah, you're facing opposition from companies that are about to pay for their pollution that has previously been free. Okay, how do you lobby against a tax, right? What do you do? What do you ask for? You ask for exemptions, you ask for tax credits, and so on. Every time there is a tax credit or an exemption for a tax per ton of CO2, pollution goes up, right? Because instead of paying for that ton, if you're a successful lobbyist, your company will not pay for that ton. Under emissions trading like the European system, California system, RGGI here in New England, that Annika had mentioned before, how do you lobby for an exemption? Well, one way, and frankly the way it's worked out in Europe, is first policymakers set the cap, the overall cap on emissions. Then they figure out how to hand out these emissions allowances, whether to auction them, whether to hand them out for free, who gets them, and so on, right? And you can already imagine the difference. If you auction them, it means polluters pay for every ton emitted. If you hand them out for free, well, if you get more free allowances, you're allowed to emit more for free. So the successful steel company lobbyist, let's say, is going to ask for many, many more free allowances. Now, here's the thing. There's only a fixed number of allowances in the system in the first place. So yeah, now that more successful lobbyist is going to get more free allowances than the less successful lobbyist. So it's, sort of competition among companies. The planet doesn't care, right? Emissions might be higher now for the steel plant than for some other plant or some other utility, but overall, emissions stay the same. So from a political economy perspective, if you will, right, that points clearly toward emissions trading as the way to go, because, the usual political shenanigans, which are going to happen, right? Of course they will. For a tax, emissions go up every time one of these trades happen. For an emissions trading system, emissions overall stay the same. The system overall might not be less equitable, there might be other problems, right? So, you have households say, wait, why do we need to pay more if the shareholders don't pay, right? This is the usual, right? Three sources of money in the world, right? Taxpayers, shareholders, and consumers, households, ratepayers. So there's this competition among them, but emissions trading, in theory, if you will, right, and in practice, allows for this sort of horse trading to happen without making pollution go up.
Okay, so just let me summarize what I heard. So lobbying will happen, so maybe we need more transparency as and when we go down this process. Second, a lot of the climate, for lack of a better word, lefties seem to think that when these so-called taxes happen, they just somehow come out of the company's pockets. They don't appreciate that the company is a legal fiction, as you said. It has to come out of somebody's pockets. And if the demand's reasonably inelastic, it just gets passed on, which raises the other dreaded issue of inflation, right? So how is a politician going to ever go and sell this to the public if by saying this is inflationary? And it's bound to be inflationary, very inflationary, right? And the other issue that I wanted to raise was Europe's idea of was it taxing imported carbon from, say, an India or a China or an Africa? How's that going to work? I mean, so you're going to basically upset the dynamics of international trade. India and China are not going to sit back. Perhaps the only thing they're competing with is maybe untaxed carbon in some sense. It's going to be very inflationary for Europe. So, any thoughts on how this import tax thing is likely to take off, or will it even take off? I mean, I know, Aniket, you've done a whole bunch of webinars on that, and if you want to chime in, and of course, Gernot, please feel free to jump.
Yeah, I'll just say a few things about the inflationary point. It is true almost by definition that we are increasing the price of something by adding a tax to it, and therefore it's more expensive. And then you could say, well, therefore it is inflationary. I would argue, though, that over the medium to long term, a energy transition will be highly disinflationary and deflationary, because the weird thing about the world right now, Shiva, which a lot of people of a certain generation just can't wrap their arms or their minds around, is that renewables are just in most places the cheapest form of energy. It's cheaper to be going renewable than using fossil fuels. So your energy costs will go down over time, not up. And this is hard for people to realize, because people who are in power in terms of managing money and running central banks and this and that, they grew up in a period when solar was, remember, 100x more expensive than it is now. It was 100 times more expensive just 40 years ago. So if you're now in your 60s and you were growing up and in your early career and people were talking about solar, you're like, that's insane. I can't do that. It's 100 times more expensive than what it is now. Now the problem with renewables, if there is one, is it's too cheap. And so investors say, oh my gosh, where am I going to get the return from if we just go down solar and wind, and particularly solar? But that's a good thing. We want cheap energy. Like that's something it might not be good for the returns, but there are lots of other things therefore to invest in. But in terms of having cheap energy, so I'm firmly of the view, for what it's worth, that the energy transition is a deflationary, it's certainly disinflationary and long-term deflationary project, because we spend a lot of money on energy right now globally. And by the way, if you add the social costs of our fossil fuels, it's an extra 10 to 20 trillion dollars a year in terms of people dying and so on and so forth, and all this spending that goes into that. So that's just what I would say about the inflationary point, and I'll hand it over to Gernot.
Yeah, actually, maybe to pile on, right? So it was Isabel Schnabel, a German economist, member of the executive committee of the European Central Bank, who introduced the terms climateflation, fossilflation, greenflation, right? So climateflation is basically, right, so extreme events piling on cost us money, stuff gets more expensive, right? Unmitigated climate change is costly, really costly. Okay, so that's one, and frankly, that's the reason why we want to act in the first place. Okay, now, when you look at action, yeah, in some sense, right, it's the balancing act between fossilflation and greenflation, right? Fossilflation is, last couple of years, right, fossil prices go through the roof. That causes inflation. It does. It truly does. And the remedy for fossilflation is to get off fossil fuels. Okay, now, if you do that, right, race to heat pumps in Europe, solar panels and so on, right? Yeah, what you might see is strains on the supply chain, right? So anecdotal evidence, but the waiting time in Austria right now for heat pumps is something like 12 to 18 months, right? There's just so much demand. Now, point is, that's a technology. Yeah, we should be ramping up supply of heat pumps and solar panels and so on and so forth, and we are. And we're addressing greenflation in the process, while also primarily addressing fossilflation, getting off fossil fuels in the first place, right? So it is a balancing act. Of course it is. Well, it's a balancing act that we know what the answer is, right? We do need to get off fossil fuels for lots of reasons, while at the same time making sure that, okay, this is sort of the New York City view now, all three of us are here in New York, right? In order to decarbonize our buildings at the speed set by Local Law 97, cutting carbon emissions by 40% by the end of the decade, New York City needs something like over 100,000 electricians to make that happen, right? So, okay, newsflash, turns out the unions, all right, the electricians unions, right, is very, very happy to support this, right? So you have labor on board with these very strict decarbonization policies, which is a good thing, of course it is. And, yeah, so we create jobs, we decarbonize, we make the place more livable. What's not to like? And yes, you address fossilflation at the same time.
Okay, so a comment and a follow up.
And
Yeah,
Shiva,
yeah, go on,
just
Aniket.
just because I want to make sure we hit the emerging market element
Yeah, I
of
was going to
this
say.
and the China. Yeah. Look, the key point, at least in my mind, is that India in particular, because India and China we have to think about as different economic animals. China's, uh, 5 to 6 times the size in terms of GDP per capita. Their CO2 emissions per capita are also around 4 to 5x that of India. They're just in very different stages of development. China is going to be peaking its emissions fairly soon. Whether it's in the next 2 years or 7 years, who knows? But that is going to happen. China, let me just remind folks on the line that it is the largest investor by far in renewable energy. It is the largest investor by far in electric vehicles. It has done more and contributed more to the energy transition than it gets credit for. Because we live in this sort of anti-China world right now in the West. We can't even say that without, without just being honest. But that's just the case. India is a different story, where the question is, how does India go from a $3,000 GDP per capita to a firmly middle-income country without CO2 a ramp up the way every other country, including China, had to go through? And I must say, I am slightly optimistic there because of the relative costs, as Gernot mentioned earlier about the importance of relative pricing. Um, we are entering a period where solar plus storage, and wind plus storage is just cheaper than coal. It just is, by the way. And yeah, and certainly, that is only going to become more the case, as the technologies improve. But what India needs to do is they need to be able to have development and decarbonization, or not, or non-carbonization at the same time. That's what the goal should be. The goal shouldn't be let's punish and further hold back India's development. And India, many countries in Southeast Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, we have to actually allow them to become wealthier, but to do so in a low carbon way. And the point that I want to make, and Shiva, you know this because you follow our research, is that for effectively every major climate problem today, there is a solution. There actually are solutions that are highly cost competitive, so you can develop, as a country in a low carbon way. It is absolutely possible. And that's what the goal should be for all of us, is to make sure the technologies and also whatever capital is needed for a country like India to use those technologies and implement them gets there. And that's what part of this summit in Paris was about, is how do we get the financial system to support that? But and not just punish them and say, no, we're not going to take your exports, India, because the CO2 emissions are too high for those products. We have to get them to the point so that their products are also low carbon. And I think that is possible where we are today.
That's great. So I was going to make two comments, but you probably touched on both, but I'll just say that for the record anyway. So are both of you being a bit Pollyanna-ish? I mean, there are going to be big winners and big losers. And who's going to take care of the losers? And who's going to stop the losers from lobbying such that they don't get out of existence, which is a huge concern. This is, an economic and a social transformation of the kind that we probably haven't attempted from a top-down perspective. If it happens organically, that's different, but it's probably not going to happen organically. So that's one comment. The second, Aniket, you mentioned several times that in geek speak, the levelized cost of energy per unit or something is actually lower for renewables. But if you look carefully, and you've probably alluded to this, the fixed cost component of that is very high per unit of, as opposed to the variable cost component. So there must be some barriers to adoption, right? If these are literally, $100 bills on the street, why haven't we seen more adoption? I think you alluded to access to capital, cost of capital is higher in emerging markets. Is there anything else? Because I hear this over and over again, and it almost sounds strange. I mean, if you go talk to somebody in Africa, they'll say, look, our cost of capital is like 15%. It's all easy for you to say. We're not being stupid here, you know. So how do you unlock that?
But that has nothing to do with the technology. But that has nothing to do with the
No, but
technology.
economics is arguably
That's the
as
point.
important, right?
No, no, no. But the reason why the cost of capital in Africa is high, it doesn't have to do with the solar technology of
No,
building out
fair,
solar. It
but
has
it's
to
a
do with
barrier to adoption, a big
credit.
one, right?
It is a barrier to, but I'll hand it over to
Of course,
Gernot
yeah.
for his thoughts, and I'll come in.
No, I mean, it's just I mean, absolutely right. So, I mean, there are plenty of barriers, right? Now, maybe sticking on sort of the energy specifically, 90+%, 93 or so percent of coal power globally is locked into contracts of 20+ years. Right? Okay, there's a barrier, right? If there ever was one, right? Now, actually, so that is less of a problem, right, in a country like India that does not have enough energy in the first place, right, is building lots and lots of electricity generation in some sense into a void. But one thing to avoid in doing so, right, is locking ourselves into the old stuff for decades to come. Of course, right? It's a lot easier to avoid the lock-in the first place than to get out of it. Now, one interesting point you mentioned, Shiva, is precisely the fact that overall, right, LCOE, to use the technical term for solar, is cheaper, right? It is the cheapest form of electricity in history. Can't get around that, right? And it's only going to get cheaper. Right? It's a technology which will only improve over time, get cheaper, whereas commodities will always fluctuate, right? Coal, gas, oil are commodities. They'll always fluctuate. Right? And it's sort of every 10 years there's some energy crisis, right? It's like, oops, wait, what? Oil is up again? Who knew that's possible, right? It's like, come on, people, right? I'm old enough to remember the last one, right? Like, okay. Okay, so, but CapEx compared to OpEx, right? The capital expenditure is more skewed toward CapEx for solar than for coal, than for those commodities where operating expenses are pretty high, relatively speaking, because you're paying for the commodity, right? So, yeah, some of the challenges, right? Like the reason why we have these 20+ year contracts for coal, these power purchasing agreements, is to make the investment in the first place possible. Okay, well, overall, capital expenditure plus operating expenditure are lower for solar, but they're more skewed towards capital expenditure, right? So the need for these longer term contracts is even higher now for solar, for renewables. And yeah, that poses a challenge, right? So it's not as simple as saying, oh, super easy, right? Let's all do this, right? There is a need for Aniket and right, people in the finance industry who know about the challenges and work on the solutions to come in and figure out how to channel more money, even more money, into renewables, into low carbon, high efficiency.
Yeah, and just to add to that, when you have periods of time when there's significant capital expenditures needed, markets on their own are not great at that, which is why you have state supported and state directed capital. Europe would not have been rebuilt after World War II on its own. You needed something like the IBRD that got set up actually after World War II, now known as the World Bank, to have channeled the resources and the financial resources and the technologies and coordinate with policymakers and so on. It's a very different project than investing in a tech company down the street, right? Or investing in a bond, a publicly issued bond. You actually need to do a lot more work, which is why I'm a big personal advocate for the role of development banks and state-owned financial institutions to drive this, knowing that there are problems with them. Of course, there are problems with state ownership of financial institutions, but I would argue that the positives outweigh the inevitable negatives. And look at history. if you study China's economic development, you know that China would not have urbanized and therefore would not have industrialized and therefore would not have gotten rich without the China Development Bank. It is by far the most important financial institution in the world, period. Just to give one of my favorite stats about the CDB, the external lending of the China Development Bank outside of China is larger than all the MDBs put together, just to give you a sense of the scale of that institution. Similarly, Germany would not have been able to be rebuilt after the war without KfW in Germany that was set up, or the World Bank. So you need state-owned directed capital. And by the way, they leverage private capital. I mean, when the World Bank issues a bond, it's purchased by private investors. It's pension funds and insurance companies who buy a very highly rated bond, and then that money goes to build out infrastructure. So all of this is to say that the market on its own doesn't do this very well. You do need the state to be involved in. Gernot very rightly talked about balance in an earlier comment he made, and finding that sort of compromise point. This is one of those topics where we will similarly have to see state and market coordination in a way that we just aren't used to. But that's coming back. I mean, the idea of industrial policy is now taking hold even here in the United States much more explicitly.
Those are fabulous comments. I mean, I've always maintained we don't understand the Chinese brand of capitalism, just reducing them to slogans and silly Twitter messages,
Right.
and they need much more serious study. But the thing
That's
that
right.
really worries me a bit, though, are these, virtually every G7, G20 country is running massive deficits. So they have to basically go find more money to do some of the things that you're talking about, Aniket. And they need the leadership and the vision and the courage, and those are things in short supply. You don't have to comment on that.
Yeah.
In the interest, but if you want to, please do. And then I want to talk about
I
voluntary
do want
markets.
to make one comment about the U.S. with regards to this, which is to say that, and this is why sustainable or financing sustainable development is so tricky. But if there's students, at the conference, it's why it's so exciting. Is you have to think about all these different components. But one of our issues in this country is that we are just a heavily under-taxed society. We are. And by the way, I say this as a Wall Street guy who actually gets paid quite a bit of money. And I'm saying that we're undertaxed. And just look at tax divided by GDP of the US versus any other high-income country. We are 10 percentage points lower tax to GDP than the OECD average. And if we collected even 5% more in taxes as a percentage of our GDP, Shiva, that's $1 trillion a year. That's $1 trillion a year. $1 trillion. So this is, we have to talk about numbers here, because sometimes people say, oh, it's so expensive, or we don't have the money, or states are crippled and they don't have the resources. No, these are choices that we have made. Certainly in this country. Now, Europe's a different story, but in this country, there's a lot more room for the government to be able to do this without borrowing money and then opening themselves up to interest rate risk, which they have at the largest of levels at the federal government.
No, Aniket, I get your point, but I think the 25 trillion on balance sheet treasury bills, which gets a lot of attention, is a small sliver of the problem. The off balance sheet liability is 3 times bigger. Unfunded Medicare, Medicaid, social. So we do have a lot of debt. And is there any capacity to tax given the lobbies here? No chance. I mean, I don't see any of that happening in the next 10 years. But anyway, I don't want to close on a pessimistic note. Let's come back to your favorite subject, voluntary markets. Delta running credits of $5 a ton and claiming it's neutral in terms of carbon and so on. The big issue there is credibility, right? I mean, verifiability, credibility. Why haven't we seen more in terms of, say, somebody, the UN, the World Bank? Is it that hard to establish a reasonably credible set of contracts with verifiability in the carbon offset space? What's the big barrier? I mean, either of you, if you want to jump in, please do.
Gernot, please come in. This is truly your topic.
Well, okay. So full disclosure, I'm woefully biased on this, and let me just start with the top headline statement. I would say the vast majority of these voluntary offsets offered by companies are BS.
I agree.
And are BS in a very clear way, right? Like, okay, so the airline example is a classic, right? Why in the world would an airline offer its passengers, right? So first you pay for the ticket, they make sure that happens. And then they give you the chance to offset emissions that your flight will have caused. Why would they do that? Okay, they don't do that to make you feel bad about flying and do less of it, right? They offer that to you to make you feel good about flying and do more of it, right? I mean, it's like, like, come on, right? Like, and okay, so why do that? Okay, and again, right? Like, I mean, okay, we can make fun of Delta all day long, right? But actually, okay, so here we go. United, right? So United, a few months ago, announced $100+ million sustainable aviation fuels venture fund. Real investment, real money in SAF, sustainable aviation fuels, right? Which is, sort of the most sustainable version, if you will. Sort of the closed loop version is you take CO2 out of thin air, you put it in liquid fuels, and then you burn it again, right? Like, and the burning emits CO2 again. But, you could imagine how this is basically the one way to fully decarbonize the aviation sector without electrifying it, without doing other things. So great, right? And by the way, SAF, sustainable aviation fuels, they already exist in small quantities, but they exist. And they are, up to a point. There's sort of the biofuels version, which is less sustainable, if you will, has its own problems. But there are ways to make synthetic kerosene that is, in fact, zero carbon. It costs $600 or so per ton of CO2. So your transatlantic flight is now $600 more expensive. Okay, Lufthansa gives you the chance to offset your emissions, and they even have the little lever on the website where you offset your emissions. If you go all the way to the left, it's $5 per ton of CO2, and it's all trees. If you go all the way to the right, it's $600 per ton of CO2, and it's sustainable aviation fuels.
I didn't know that. Wow.
Okay. Now, right? First of all, why do they give you the chance? Well, because, this is like, I booked a family vacation to Austria, right, to see my parents. The kids are standing behind me, right? Papa, look, there's a tree, let's do something good, right? Offset emissions. Okay, well, yes, of course, right? I'm not a complete asshole, so yes, let's do it. But, let's pay the $5, not the $600, right? Okay, by now I'm sort of in this fortunate position where every time I do fly across the Atlantic especially, I make the conference organizer pay for the sustainable aviation fuels, right? Wow. Okay, cool. But again, right, the vast majority of offsets are the $5 kind, not the $600 kind. And again, back to my first question, right? Why would airlines offer this if it weren't about making you feel good about flying? Right, so when United gives you the chance to donate $5, $10 to the Sustainable Aviation Fuel Fund, it's to make you feel good, right? Like, I mean, this is sort of, I don't know any other scenario where a company asks you to donate to a VC fund, right? To a venture fund, literally, right? Like, we put in $100 million and we're trying to make money off this thing. Dear customer, donate $5 to make you feel good about, right, emitting CO2. Okay, so that's the big picture, right? To me, that volunteerism just isn't going to work. Now, Aniket before, right, mentioned there are good reasons to also feel optimistic about this because, right, this is sort of the entry level, like, companies are beginning to pay for pollution. It's an order of magnitude less than they should, but, trees are good, right? I mean, basically, this is the other side of this. At the end of the day, yeah, we do need to find ways to pay for maintaining ecosystems, forests, tropical forests especially perhaps, and that costs money, right? So who's going to pay for this? That's the flip side, of course.
I think that's such a nice and balanced way to talk about it, Gernot, and it's such an important balance that's needed in this space, because it's not all bad and it's not the panacea, and it's a little bit of both. And there are some myths out there that deserve busting around voluntary markets. So, for example, one of the myths out there is that, well, companies that buy offsets do it instead of decarbonizing. The empirical evidence shows that is not the case. In fact, the companies that are buying offsets are actually decarbonizing their own operational emissions 2 times as fast as their sectors. Okay? Because it makes sense. If you really care about this issue, you're doing as much as you can, and for what's left over, you're buying offsets, right? The second myth busting around this is that all the money you spend in all offsets are bullshit. Also a myth. I think about frontier climate, and this is I agree with Gernot, even though our starting point is maybe a little on the other side. Frontier climate is an effort that came out of a bunch of companies on the West Coast to create a direct air capture, a carbon removal industry. And they pulled together close to $1 billion. And he said, we will be the advanced market commitment. So we are ensuring that there is demand for high quality supply of direct air capture credits, for which we will spend up to $1,000 a ton. Mind you, $1,000 a ton. And because they say, well, let's start there. Let's get a lot of people thinking about direct air capture, knowing that there's going to be demand for credits. And then the technology curves will mean in 10, 20, 30 years, that will come down. Now, we all may have different strong views about the role of direct air capture in getting to net zero. The IEA, by the way, is supportive of it for what it's worth. But so again, now is that carbon credit or carbon offset bad? Is it bad that's I don't think so, right? Is it bad that Climeworks, Swiss company, is out there showing that carbon removal is possible? And by the way, already the costs of carbon removal have come down because of the voluntary markets. They're the people who are buying those credits are buying it in a voluntary way. So again, it's not all bad and it's not all good. We need standards, and we need to understand it is a part of the solution. Now, the thing that I find funny about the voluntary world is that it's such a small market. It's effectively negligible from a macroeconomic perspective. I think last year there was $2 billion of voluntary carbon credits purchased. $2 billion. That's nothing. I mean, it's like literally chump change in a $100 trillion world economy. And so it's just funny. It gets a lot of attention. I would argue that the voluntary space gets more attention than the compliance market. And I'm glad, Shiva, because you're so great at your job, you understand the relative importance of both, that we've spent 90% of today talking about the official carbon markets, the emissions trading systems, carbon tax. That's the real money. That's the real stuff. This is a small, very, very small part of it. And just to put things in perspective, the IEA thinks that there will be $1.7 trillion spent on the energy transition this year. Solar, wind, EVs, all of that. And 2 billion with the B in the voluntary world. So it's not even it's 0.1%, if my math is right. 0.1%, 1/1000. And so it's something that we should keep in mind. And that's why Gernot's point is absolutely correct, that this will not be solved the climate will not be solved through voluntary mechanisms like this. It's fine. It's okay. Like, whatever, like, who gives a shit? But what we need sustainable aviation fuel prices to come down massively. And that'll happen through government investment, through public-private partnerships, all of that kind of stuff, not through voluntary carbon markets.
Okay.
Right? Wouldn't you agree or not? Isn't that sort of the right way to think about it?
Yes,
like,
I mean,
you're the expert,
absolutely.
but I'm just,
well,
we're trying to deal with this at Jefferies and advise our clients, and that's where we've come down on it. Does that
I mean, basically, put your money toward climbing the learning curve,
Yeah.
sliding down the cost curve
Right.
on low carbon, high efficiency activities, and that frankly are core to your business, right? Okay, so I mean, here's another way to look at this, right? Okay, so sector by sector, technology by technology, there are dozens of ways to cut emissions 5%. Right? Like, this is like, like some company in the manufacturing sector, right, having the bike to work day for its employees and like the let's turn off lights in headquarters type thing. Like, do that, of course, right? Like, don't waste electricity on lights that you can't figure out how to turn off at night, right? Like, of course, right? Don't be stupid, right? Okay, sure. But that's not the core of your business, right? If you're a steel company, turning off lights at headquarters isn't going to cut your emissions significantly beyond the 5%, right? Basically. Okay. So in other words, sector by sector, technology by technology, there are basically one or two ways, or maybe three, to actually cut emissions 100%, right? Like 80, 90, 100%. And you might still need offsets, right? You might still need to suck the rest out of thin air, right? With the Frontier Fund investments and so on. Amazing, of course, let's do that. But it's the final 20, not the final 80, 90,
Bravo.
95%, right? Okay, so offsets have a role. Direct air capture has a role in certain sectors much more than in others, right? But, okay, so let's say the building sector, right? If you are a major real estate company, let's say in New York City, right, and you are trying to claim that you're carbon neutral by basically buying cheap renewable energy credits or cheap offsets at like $3, $5 per ton of CO2, while basically burning, right, bunker fuels in your oil furnace, right, you have a real problem, right? Well, what are the solutions? Okay, building sector, okay, it's insulate, and electrify, right? That's it, right? And then decarbonize the electric sector, of course, right? But, that's it. That's where your investments should go, the major one. And yeah, it's about climbing the learning curve, sliding down the cost curve, as it is in every sector. And this is why I really liked your comment, Annika, before about, right? So, I mean, basically starting to, thanking the Chinese for helping us do that, right? And, I might expand that and say for solar, frankly, it's brushing up on your German and brushing up on your Chinese, right? You thank the Germans for subsidizing the demand side, and you thank the Chinese for subsidizing the supply side, right? In a major way. And I think that's it, right? And basically, volunteerism, right, is important, right? Actually, it's really important in this sense. If you are a rich homeowner and you do not have a heat pump and don't have fantastic insulation, first of all, you're going to smell the wildfire smoke indoors, right about now. So, this is good for you too, right? And the fact that a heat pump and an induction stove, right, makes your own home more valuable, right? Like, this is such a no-brainer, right? Like, you have $100,000 sitting around for your $2 million home. This is where you put the money, right? Not the, the wine cellar or the sauna or the swimming pool or whatever. Insulate your freaking home and cut the gas line, right? It makes it for a much better cooking, heating, cooling, living experience than anything else you do. Offsets will still play a role for the last 5%, right? Yeah. Not the first 95.
That's right. Yeah, and it's funny you say that. I know we only have a little bit of time left, but we did this great webinar with Professor Jacobson from Stanford yesterday, and he was one of the slides was about his home and how he lives in California, how solar on the roof, heat pump, this, that, and he just showed the numbers. He's like, this is how much I used to spend on all this stuff for the gas and the electricity and the fuel for my car. And this is how much I spend now. And I paid back all the investments in 5 years, and now I'm making money. I'm literally making money by having a net zero home or a zero emitting home. And people have to get into that. I know it, like, for a lot of people, it's like, I can't believe that's the case. It's like cognitive dissonance, but it's true. It just is. It takes some work, but it's true.
Yeah.
It's funny.
Yes. Right?
Okay, so time's running away, especially when you have some fun. A final question before and you may not even want to answer this. Maybe this is a whole new webinar. Uh, Elections, right? Next year.
Pass.
if if a different party comes to power, what happens to all this? If you want to pass, that's totally fine. But that's a question I'm sure on
No,
investors'
okay.
minds, right, Aniket?
No, actually, so here's a very quick answer. Aniket, you mentioned 40 years ago solar panels 100 times more expensive, right? So Jimmy Carter put solar panels on the White House. 5 years later, Reagan took them down. Nobody is taking down solar panels from any roof because they are the cheapest form of electricity, right? So what does it mean? Actually, okay, here's about, I can't get more political than this. I forget the guy's name, but the guy who puts his kids, like, who takes a family picture with every kid with like automatic machine gun, right?
Yeah.
Who's the guy? Massey or whatever his name is? I don't forget, right?
Yeah.
This sort of, Republican blowhard, right? His home is fully energy independent.
Wow.
He has panels on the roof. He has a total Tesla battery. Like literally, he took the battery out of a total Tesla, and that's his energy storage. And he built it all himself because he's some MIT engineer, right? Like sort of like you can't be right. Like it doesn't get more one-sided politically if the gun picture is any is a testimony to that. And he is fully independent from the grid, right? Now, for different reasons, right? He's not the Mark Jacobson, this is for the climate, right? But guess what the side effect is? Emissions from heating his home are zero, right? Because, well, he did it for those reasons. And yes, it pays for itself. Yes, it's a wise financial investment. This is not politics anymore. If there is a form of electricity that IEA, International Energy Agency, rightfully declares the cheapest form of electricity in history, right? This is just pure, raw, self-interested economics. If you don't heat your home using a heat pump, cool your home, by the way, using a heat pump. Actually, I mean, even sort of these sort of misconceptions, right? Where like, wait, heat pump? You can cool your place with it? Yes!
Yeah.
It's a better way of doing it than anything that has come before. It's just a fundamentally better technology. This is beyond politics.
I agree with that. And I think that we always have to scratch below the surface, scratch below the headlines, get, and realize that business is in a very different place than they were 10, 20, 30 years ago on climate. Investors are in a different place. The lobbying effort isn't as voraciously against an energy transition as it once was. This is still going to be hard as heck. I mean, none of us, and of all people, Gernot is not Pollyannish because, if you read his book, Climate Shock, just how clear he thinks about these things. But we know how challenging this will be. I don't think U.S. politics, federal politics, is going to be the main issue. For me, the big issue in the U.S., if we want to talk about specifically, is the grid. We hosted the team from the Lawrence Berkeley National Labs a few weeks ago with their paper on interconnection queues. There's a power system that is waiting to get built in this country. It has applied for interconnection. 95% of that power system is solar, wind, and storage. 95% of it. And by the way, the amount of applications, if you add them up, is 50% larger than the current U.S. power system. So that's to Gernot's point about raw economics. That's project developers and utilities. These are not tree huggers. These are the people who are actually building renewables or building energy projects, saying we want renewables because it's the cheapest thing. But if we can't figure out how to link it up to the grid, if we can't build the transmission lines, very complicated things, by the way, all solvable but complicated, then this isn't going to happen. So I would say let's spend less time thinking about Washington politics and start thinking more about policy and figure out how we solve transmission, figure out how we solve permitting, figure out how we solve investments and adaptation and so on. And you can bring more people together than what meets the eye.
Okay, we'll leave it there. We promised a masterclass. I think we've more than delivered, especially you gentlemen. Thank you so much for doing this. I know we've busy people taking time out of your extremely busy schedules, meeting students, meeting investors, or both. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I'll leave it there. Pleasure as always, and I owe you both lunch, dinner, or something more. Thank you.
A nice
A nice
dosa.
dosa.
All
That's
right,
what you.
Shiva.
A nice,
That's
yeah,
what, both of you. Okay.
homemade dosa
Homemade
Homemade dosa.
dosas.
Will do. Will do.
on your induction stove, fully decarbonized
Oh no, no! I
induction
still
stove.
use methane. I love my old
Oh,
gas
come
stove.
on! That's,
Don't be
okay,
like
forget the dosa. That's
That's
it.
it. Oh, so I'm
No.
blacklisted now, I guess. Anyway. Thank you, sir. Thanks
All
both
right.
of you.
Hey,
It's a
thank you.
pleasure.
This was
Take
fun.
care. This was fun. See you guys.